I have seen deserts that keep secrets like monks. Their silence is not emptiness but devotion. Wind moves across them like a hand smoothing a troubled brow, and everything that was loud becomes small, and everything that was small becomes true. In such a place, a name does not travel fast. It travels far. It is carried the way water is carried, carefully, reverently, with both hands. Salah al-Din. The syllables were not always a banner. Once, they were only a hush in the ear of a boy who did not yet know the quarrel the world would have with him. The story does not begin with a sword. It begins with a kindness the world mistook for weakness and a patience the world mistook for delay. It begins in houses of dust where lamps smoked and books breathed, in courtyards where the moon revised the day and made plain things luminous, a clay jug, a reed mat, a father's shadow stretching over a boy's shoulder while he learned to read lines that would later become the scaffolding of a life. It begins with the understanding that mercy is not the absence of strength, it is the discipline of it. In the distance, empires gnawed each other like wolves forced into the same narrow cage. Kings with throats full of marble words promised God their victories and then asked their scribes to explain their defeats. Cities grew gardens to cover old burn marks. The sea kept bringing back the same ships with different flags. And somewhere in all this noise, a young Kurdish boy learned that triumph is not what you take, it is what you leave intact. His mother's hands smelled of bread and cumin, of the subtle, sustaining work that never arrives with a trumpet. Children who are loved learn the shape of the world by the warmth of a bowl pressed into their palms, by the truthful cadence of a voice that tells them they are more than a blade waiting to be lifted. Salah al-Din, Yusuf to those who knew him then, grew through the kind of quiet that many mistake for smallness, the quiet that listens, the quiet that gathers. There were men in armor even then, men whose laughter struck stone and whose steps claimed courtyards as if they were maps waiting for new borders. They were not cruel. They were convinced, which is a more dangerous thing. Convinced that swiftness is always wisdom, that noise is always power. Yusuf watched them, and he did not mock them. He asked the wind questions instead, patient things like, "What do you learn when you pass the same dune each day? And how long does it take for the sun to forgive a night?" He learned that speed is not the same as arrival. He learned that the victory that must be declared is often already tired. He learned, by listening to men greater and lesser than himself, that the heart of a city can be approached like a fortress or like a prayer, and that the results will be equally durable. The first stories that reached him were not of crusades, nor banners, nor sieges. They were stories of neighbors, the dispute over an olive tree that grew halfway between two homes, the restless horse that chewed its reins and dragged a scolded boy through dust until his grandfather intervened, the scholar with one blind eye who could recite verses like water, who argued that a city was only a body, and that its markets were the blood, its schools the breath, its courts the bones, and the places of worship the cautious. Luminous mind. If you wound the mind, the scholar said, the body remembers and limps for generations. Yusuf remembered that when men shouted for war that made the map trembled. He would remember later, when he was asked to answer iron with iron, salt with salt. But for now, He was a boy moving between rooms that smelled of lamp oil and parchment, a boy who learned to keep his back straight not out of pride but out of duty to the breath God placed in him. There were tutors, of course, men with beards like unfurled wings, with fingers stained the color of ink and dates. They taught him lines from the Quran and lines from the poets, taught him the arithmetic of harvests, and the geometry of kindness, how to measure a man by what he shelters rather than what he breaks. He listened without interrupting. Those who knew him then would later say that the most dangerous thing about Salah al-Din was not his armies. It was his silence, and the way it forced men to hear themselves. The world kept arriving at the boy's threshold. News came rolled in the throats of travelers whose sandals had learned the patience of long roads. Echoes of crusading lords, of quarrels across seas whose waves did not care who owned the shore today, only that the moon kept its appointment with the tide. Names crossed his hearing: Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, like birds whose flight vectors would one day intersect with his shadow. Not yet. For now, he gathered them like smooth stones and placed them where his hand could find them later. In the evenings, his father would speak with him plainly, as men speak when they want to leave no ruins in a child's trust. Strength must know where to stand, he would say, and Yusuf would imagine a river choosing a new bank. And mercy must know when to stop, he would add, and the boy would imagine rain deciding not to drown a valley it could easily claim. Courage is not going. It is staying with what you have promised. These were not slogans. They were shakings of the earth, and they taught Yusuf that the longest road is often the shortest way home. There were, around him, voices that despaired of the map and its quarrels, who believed history was a mill that ground the good into flour for the proud to eat. He listened to them and decided something without telling anyone, that if he must become a wheel, he would turn slow enough for hands to rest on him without being torn, and steady enough for a child to sleep against his shoulder while he moved. He would become a kind of strength the impatient had no language for. In the hills, boys learn stones and wind before they learn the names of kings. Yusuf learned to read the shoulder of a hill the way a physician reads a pulse. He learned which paths seem short but make fools of the thirsty. He learned that a horse's breath tells the truth when a rider's words do not. He learned the color of honest fatigue and the taste of dishonest urgency. These things seem small in a city. They are tyrants in a desert. On certain nights, the ones when the sky looked like a bowl turned over to keep the earth's heat from escaping, he would climb to a flat place and lie on his back and let the constellations arrange his spine. He would imagine armies moving like shadows of clouds, and he would wonder why men answered fear with multiplication, adding more iron to the equation as if steel could solve hunger or grief. He would imagine an army taught to arrive like water at a fire, to surround, to cool, to leave the stones unbroken. He had no word for it then. He would earn one later, restraint. There was a moment, a small scene no historian would deem grand enough for an annal, when a quarrel broke in the street. A mule had bitten a boy, and the boy's uncle had raised a stick, and the mule's owner had raised a shout. People gathered as people do, not out of malice but relief. Someone else was making the day's noise. Yusuf stepped between them. He spoke quietly, which made them angrier at first, because rage is a horse that hates a hand on its halter. He asked for the stick and held it by the thin part, and said, "This is a lever. It will move whatever you press it against, the mule's back, the boy's skull, your own house. Choose the stone you want to loosen." They lowered their voices. They called him presumptuous. He agreed and kept speaking until the street remembered how to breathe. No one thanked him. He went home satisfied anyway. He had learned that peace rarely arrives to applause. The first time he held a sword long enough to feel its thought, he did not feel a crown waking in his palm. He felt the weight of a door. This can open or this can close. He cut the air a few times, and the air healed itself, and he decided to remember that. Later, when men shouted his name as if it could stop blood from spreading, he would repeat the lesson: the wound you avoid is also a victory. It does not photograph well, but it lasts. As adolescence retreated like a hesitant tide, responsibility arrived with boots on. He began to ride with men who measured dawn by its usefulness, who saw the world as parcels to be secured, messengers to be intercepted, conversations to be concluded on terms that clinked. They were not villains. They were instruments eagerly awaiting a hand to tune them. Yusuf watched, learned their tempos, but stayed a fraction of a beat behind, as if listening for a drumline no one else could hear. When he finally faced an enemy, if a border skirmish deserves so heavy a word, it was not the clash that marked him. It was the aftermath. He found a boy the age he had been when he watched the mule dispute, a boy whose eyes had already begun to build protective walls. The boy's hand shook around a blade that had not yet learned his name. Yusuf took the blade gently and handed the boy water instead. "Drink first," he said, "so you can decide with a wet tongue. Mercy looks like softness to the hurried. To those who can wait, it looks like a foundation." The land around him kept its old promises. Olives and dust, a horizon careful not to betray the sun's eventual return, caravans whose bells invented the patience of distance. But the map beyond his immediate breath began to lean toward him, as if the weight of other men's oaths had started to roll downhill. Words like Antioch and Acre took on temperatures. Names like Baldwin and Reynold became flints that threw sparks when struck against local tongue and custom. The rumor of Jerusalem was the kind of rumor a man wears like a talisman inside his chest. Not yet a demand. A direction. He learned to pray in ways that did not embarrass hunger. He learned to kneel without making obedience a theater. He learned to rise without making leadership a costume. People began to notice that when the room quarreled, he did not. He translated. He took heat and turned it into light. This is a kind of alchemy the greedy never value because it deposits no coins. It deposits futures. One evening, a messenger arrived with dust on his face like an extra skin. He brought news that did not fit inside his mouth. The world beyond their gates had broken another agreement with itself. A fortress had changed hands with a treachery so clumsy it felt like a prophecy of larger carelessness to come. The elders argued for retaliation, for a gesture that would teach a lesson that could be seen from a distance. Yusuf waited until the room was tired of its own teeth. "A lesson," he said softly, "is not what you perform. It is what you remember the next time you are tempted to forget. The room quieted. No decision was made that night. That, too, was a decision. The seasons continued their reliable apostasy. Summer renounced winter, winter renounced summer, and both confessed in spring. Yusuf watched men fall in love with the sound of their own certainty, and decided he would love something else, results that did not need to be announced. He trained his body the way a scribe trains his hand, repeating motions until the gesture forgot it was a performance, and became a habit. He trained his mind to open slowly and close firmly, like a good gate. There were moments of fear. Courage is not a lake you discover, it is a well you return to with shaking hands. He knew the temptation to become efficient at cruelty, because cruelty often works quickly and leaves clean borders. He decided, again and again, because this is not a single decision, that he would be efficient at patience instead. That he would learn to win so that the enemy's children would not inherit a permanent loneliness. A hawk began to shadow his rides. It was not tamed, only companionable in the way freedom sometimes is when it recognizes itself in a moving thing. He watched it climb thermals invisible to the eye. Men later would say he learned strategy from generals. He learned some of it from a hawk, the art of letting heat lift you, the discipline of waiting until the shape of the ground tells you what surrender looks like. He was not yet Salah al-Din in the way the world would one day say it, like a bell rung to disperse smoke, like a door name that persuades a house to stand in an earthquake. He was a young man with a growing solitude, and solitude is the tuition of command. The price is paid in unshared laughter, and in advice you must ignore from men you respect. He carried that cost without advertising it. He had already learned that the loudest sacrifices are often the cheapest. When the summons finally came that would set his life's compass, an invitation wrapped inside a duty folded inside a larger, inevitable quarrel, he felt no rush of destiny. He felt the acacia-root certainty that the next step was not a leap but simply a continuation of the road he had been walking since he stepped between a stick and a mule. He saddled his resolve the way a man saddles a horse he has cared for, with gratitude and with checks along the strap. He looked back only once, and it was not to admire his beginnings or to grieve his leaving. It was to memorize the angle of his mother's doorway, the way light gathered at its base as if reluctant to cross the threshold. He promised himself that wherever he went, he would arrange doorways like that, places where light could rest before it moved on. Thus he began, quietly, as important things do, toward a world that had already decided what kind of man it needed him to be. He would disappoint the impatient by being deliberate. He would surprise the violent by being merciful. He would unsettle the cunning by winning with his hands open. The desert kept its vows and let him pass. The wind, good monk that it is, whispered no prophecy. But if you stood there, in the line of his dust, and turned your face to follow him, you might have heard what I swear I heard, not a song of battle, but the low music of a gate swinging wide, steel deciding to be shelter, strength deciding to be shelter, a man deciding to be a nation's memory of how to stand. Tikrit was not a cradle of thunder, it was a lesson in proportion. River light drifted along the Tigris like a thread looking for a needle's eye, and every morning had the decency to arrive in small increments. First the paler rim of the east, then the softened bark of sycamores, then the steady glow that taught jars and sandals their names again. In such places, ambition grows like a root rather than a banner. It looks downward first, testing the soil that must hold it when storms come. Yusuf learned early that a city is not a wall but a bargain. Its people loan their faith to one another each sunrise and ask to be repaid at dusk with bread, with safety, with the familiar sound of hawkers teasing figs into sweetness with their voices. He walked its lanes with the composure of someone collecting ledgers no one else knew existed. How much patience a neighbor still had for a noisy apprentice. How much grief a widow was hiding behind her collar. How much debt the butcher owed to sleep. He took note without vanity, as if the city had quietly entrusted him with a set of balances he was not yet licensed to adjust. His father Ayub knew what stones weighed in a man's pocket. He taught his son the arithmetic of consequence. When you move a soldier, you move 10 mothers. When you tax a caravan, you tax the courage that brought it here. Count those things. The advice did not glitter. It entered the bone the way winter enters door frames, quietly, without asking permission, and all at once indispensable. On evenings when the house smelled of stew and lamp smoke, father and son sat with a chessboard between them, and the elder man did not teach by winning. He taught by letting his son see how many victories are merely tidy defeats that have not been learned to speak yet. There were days when the river came brimming with rumor. Rafts floated past like whispers with cargo, copper ringing against itself, papyrus wrapped like sleeping birds, and news braided through it all, that a lord farther west had pledged his honor to a distant cross, that a governor nearer at hand had pledged his honor to his own reflection, that men somewhere were asking God to pick a side as if the maker of water would busy himself with thirst's banners. Yusuf listened with the patience of a field, taking what the sky gave, keeping what the season could use. He loved the library more than the courtyard. Not because he disliked the open air. He rode well, he breathed deep, but because the hush between shelves felt like a covenant. The books did not flatter him. They asked him to become larger than he was so that he might carry them without spilling meaning. A one-eyed scribe, Bashir, guided his hungers towards steadier foods. History that did not lie, law that did not wobble, poetry that did not apologize for tenderness. A ruler with no poems, Bashir warned, is a millstone without grain. He will turn and turn and turn and grind nothing but the air. At the mosque, the imam's voice braided mercy to command the way a rope braids strands for strength. Yusuf learned that prayer is not a theater but a calibration, that the bow of the spine is a memory device to keep arrogance from forgetting the floor, that to say, God is greater, is to say also, therefore I may be smaller, and it is safe to be so. When he rose from the mat, he did not bring incense with him. He brought steadiness, and the steadiness did not announce itself. Tikrit had its quarrels. A cart's wheel splintered on a rut and spilled dates into the dust, and men argued as if the fruit were children. The spice seller's boy chased a stray goat through a perfumer's stall, and a day's profit evaporated into a cloud of wasted scent. A stonemason feuded with a tannery over whose runoff owned the alley. Small wars, but wars nonetheless, with their own banners and their own trumpets disguised as wounded pride. When they called for elders, sometimes they called for Ayyub. When they called for Ayyub and found him away, they called for the boy who listened like a wall listens, without interrupting, without bending, yet somehow absorbing the strike. He did not deliver edicts. He asked questions that made men hear what they were saying to themselves. What do you win if he loses his bread? To a merchant enraged at a debtor. He did not deliver edicts. He asked questions that made men hear what they were saying to themselves. What do you win if he loses his bread? To a merchant enraged at a debtor. What part of the alley belongs to the river, and is that the part you are arguing to keep? To the mason. If the goat were yours, would you want the boy thrashed, or would you want your goat taught? To the perfumer. His solutions rarely pleased everyone. That was not their work. Their work was to leave the city slightly more merry to itself than before. Children measured him with childish scales. Could he throw a stone farther than the lamplighter? Could he climb the granary ladder without looking down? Could he laugh hard enough to make pigeons burst upward in a startle of wings? He passed their tests when he could and failed them when he must, and the children forgave him because gravity kept forgiving them, too. They did not know they were looking at a future that would test itself by not falling in love with applause. Some men are raised by accident, others are raised by friction. Tikrit was a patient roughness against which the boy's convictions took polish. He learned from water how to insist without shouting. He learned from merchants how to bargain without lying. He learned from shepherds how to sense danger without worshipping it. He learned from widows how dignity is a form of wealth that consumes no firewood but warms a house anyway. His first taste of command came wrapped in the unromantic paper of logistics. A convoy needed routing. The ford downstream had eaten 3 axles that season. The hill path above was hostage to loose stones, and a rumor said bandits had learned a prayer that made them invisible. The men argued for speed, which is how cargo likes to brag about itself. Yusuf argued for arrival. A caravan that knows it will reach evening, he said, will not panic at noon. He split the train into thirds, one to test the hill, laden with what could be spared, one to repair the ford with brush and stone, one to wait with the impatient and learn again the usefulness of waiting. It took longer. They arrived with more to sell than if they had hurried. No one cheered. He did not expect them to. He was learning the algebra of outcomes, the way time and patience multiply each other in the presence of fear. Boys his age boasted in the lanes with the swords they were allowed to carry on festival days. Yusuf oiled his blade and put it away. He had not yet found an enemy that could not be taught into something else. This did not make him naive. It made him attentive. He knew that there were men in the world who mistook mercy for a negotiable instrument, and would try to spend it twice. He knew the difference between a wolf you can face with a torch and a wolf you must face with dogs. But he resisted the seduction of a solution that shouts simply because it is loud. He grew tall enough for strangers to assume he was unafraid. Bashir corrected him gently. Courage is not a coat. It is a bruise that convinces you to return to the same task. The boy carried that sentence the way some men carry knives in their boots, out of sight, precisely because it was meant for use. News of princes and crusaders arrived like poorly aimed arrows, noisy, often inaccurate, still capable of wounding if a man stood foolishly exposed. A Frankish lord had burned a village as if light were a way to erase a crime. A Turkish atabeg had punished a scribe as if ink could betray a throne. A market somewhere had been forced to sell grief as entertainment. The world was practicing for a larger quarrel. Tikrit listened with the defensive kindness of a small house adding an extra loaf to the oven. When the summons came for Ayyub and his household to move, politics doing what they do when they mistake themselves for weather, the boy watched his mother fold linen with the care of someone packing memory. Doors are not only wooden, they are agreements with a place, and closing them can feel like breaking a promise you never made. He walked the lanes one last time, not as a farewell tour, but as an inventory. What had the city given him that he must not lose? The way the baker's face softened when he explained the cost of wheat to a poor man without humiliation. The way the muezzin's voice rose at dawn not to conquer sleep but to braid men together across rooftops. The way the river slid under bridges without insult. He decided to be like that. Necessary, unobtrusive, and steady enough to hold weight that was not his own. The road away was not exile. It was an apprenticeship. Mosul's scent reached him first, sharper spices, louder bargaining, a busier quarrel between minaret and skyline. The world widened the way an argument widens when it begins to include examples. He watched commanders put their fingers on maps as if they were healing a fever with pressure. He watched courtiers bend phrases until meaning cracked. He watched soldiers swear oaths they would not be permitted to keep because peace, when it interrupts a profitable rage, is often forbidden by men who have built shops in the alley between grudge and retaliation. He kept his counsel. Not because he loved secrecy, but because he was learning the value of arrival again, the patience to let a world announce its soft spots before you press. A hawk found him there too, in the bright weather above the city. Perhaps it was the same bird that had shadowed his rides. Perhaps hawks are merely a nation with many emissaries and one dialect. He watched its circles and learned an angle he had not yet mastered, how to pretend indifference until gravity itself forgets to oppose you. One night, after a day spent watching men argue whether honor could be traded for advantage and then bought back with glory, he walked the inside of the city wall, palm along the stone, fingers reading the masonry the way a reader reads a familiar poem. A guard approached, a veteran with a smile carved by old injuries into something that looked like resignation from afar and like compassion up close. "Do you seek weaknesses, Lord?" the man asked, not knowing yet to whom he spoke. "I seek promises," the boy answered, surprising them both. "Stone is only a vow men keep with lime. I want to know which parts of us will remember to stand when the proper nouns change." The guard laughed once, not mockery, relief. "Then learn our names," he said. "A wall is a choir. Without voices, it is only echo." They walked together, and the man told him who among the watch was quick to kindness and who was quicker to alarm, who needed a slower order to obey it well, who needed a firmer tone to obey it at all. Strategy is not a map, it is a census of souls. Yusuf slept that night as if his pillow were an oath. Letters arrived, summons and suggestions wrapped in silk and threat. Somewhere beyond his hearing, a man named Nur al-Din counted the debts he felt owed to God and history and began to collect. Somewhere beyond that, kings with antlered helmets sharpened the rumor of crusade against the whetstone of piety until both instruments sang. The river kept its appointments anyway. Bread rose. Babies cried with the democratic authority of hunger. The world insisted on being particular while men tried to make it obey their generalities. The boy's lessons continued, now in a narrower script. He learned which compliments were bait. He learned the temperature of a lie by the length of time it required to cool. He learned that some men cannot hear truth unless it damages their enemies, and that such men are more dangerous than the enemies they claim to hate. He learned to keep a ledger no one could steal, a list of moments when restraint saved more futures than victory would have. He tucked those moments like coins into a purse that would later pay for mercy his critics would call extravagance. He did not become hard. He became exact. The softness people mistook for hesitation was an instrument he was tuning for delicate surgery. The first time a commander asked his advice on a matter of supply, how to feed men who believed that hunger was beneath them, Yusuf suggested simply that honor eats last. If captains are served after the youngest, he said, hunger will find no purchase on rank. The commander scoffed. Then he tried it. Then he claimed the idea had been his all along. The men ate without hating their betters. The camp slept. He added the small victory to his hidden ledger, and did not reach for a pen made of trumpets. When word finally came that would bend his path toward Egypt, a land whose very name sounded like the plural of river, the boy from Tikrit did not thrill at the prospect of palaces or crowns. He thrilled at the possibility that a city might be taught to breathe with both lungs, justice and patience. He had seen what impatience does to stone. He had watched how cruelty eats a city from the inside like a disease whose fever feels like vigor until the patient collapses in applause for his own illusions. He stood at the edge of departure and looked back one last time, as he had looked back when leaving Tikrit. Cities are teachers who do not grade papers. They watch you go and wait to see whether you will quote them accurately in your deeds. Yusuf promised without speaking, to carry the measure of small houses into large rooms, to keep the honesty of river light in the darker corridors of power, to remember that victory that humiliates is merely a pause before a revenge that thinks itself a prayer. Thus did the boy of Tikrit gather his quiet and lay it across his shoulders like a cloak that could confuse both heat and cold. He would need it. Beyond the horizon, men were already building ladders against walls not yet drawn on maps. Beyond the horizon, flags were practicing the art of looking immortal. Beyond the horizon, a patient lion was learning the angle of his future roar, not to terrify, but to make a path through panic for those who wished to pass without trampling what they hoped to save. Damascus wears its mornings like silk, cool first, then warming as if the sun were a careful hand unrolling a bolt of light across stone and water. The Barada River whispers the vocabulary of orchards, and the air learns sweetness early, the way a child learns to forgive before he learns to fight. To arrive here after the stricter colors of the north is to be reminded that some cities defend themselves not with walls first, but with beauty. You approached less like a conqueror and more like someone removing shoes before stepping into a room that has already said a prayer. Yusuf entered Damascus not as a thunderclap, but as a listener with dust on his cloak and a ledger in his mind. He had come to serve, to study, to be burnished by a court that measured men by the temper of their patience as much as by the weight of their arm. In its bazaars, brass spoke sunlight back to the sky. In its schools, arguments braided text to experience until they held like rope. In its baths, steam unlocked what warlocks could not, secrets that were only stiffness leaving the body. Here, a man could be sharpened without becoming a blade. He learned early that Damascus had two tempos: the public tempo of proclamation and the private tempo of correction. In the public tempo, drums did their appointed work, and heralds stitched the news into sentences that could travel across thresholds without offense. In the private tempo, elders checked the pulse of policy the way a physician checks a wrist, 3 fingers down, counting the truth beneath the theater. The boy from Tikrit discovered he could move in both, speaking loudly enough to be heard when law required it, speaking softly enough to be obeyed when dignity asked. Under Nur al-Din's shadow, long, disciplined, the kind of shadow that shields as much as it measures, Yusuf watched a craft he had only glimpsed at smaller scales: how to make piety useful, how to yoke righteousness to administration so that neither broke the other's yoke. The Atabeg did not need flattery. He needed results that could survive a winter. He was not sentimental about iron, but neither was he infatuated with it. He asked for cities that breathed, for borders that were remembered by fairness rather than by scars. It is a rare teacher who demands both prayer and provisioning with the same uncompromising tone. In that school, the younger man thrived. He studied the map as a biography rather than as geometry. Why this road envies that river, why that hill brags to this plain, why a fortress here will always sleep with one eye open because the wind tells it stories of betrayal that it cannot stop hearing. He learned that a garrison placed in the wrong village will make theologians out of bakers and rebels out of men who only ever wanted quieter ovens. He traced the routes of grain and the routes of rumor and noticed the one thing they shared: an allergy to cruelty. Grain will not travel where soldiers eat before the orphans. Rumor will not rest where rulers confess mistakes in daylight. There were days of drills, the soft thunder of hooves becoming a single thought across the parade ground. There were nights of council, oil lamps turning air into ember while voices tried to find a justice that would not collapse when shouted at. In both, Yusuf practiced the same art, subtracting haste. He did not slow decisions. He removed the panic from them, the way a physician lances a swelling so that the body can heal on time rather than on gossip. The city taught him the diplomacy of thresholds. A door is a theology. It declares who must knock, who may enter, who must be invited. He learned to arrange thresholds in conversation, what to concede early to save what mattered later, what to refuse gently so a man could retreat with his face still his own. This is not cowardice. It is masonry for agreements. The strongest treaty is the one that permits both signers to keep their grandchildren's respect. In Damascus he met men who had seen the Frankish courts, men with Latin in their mouths and Arabic in their chests, translators whose profession had taught them the most difficult translation of all, turning victory into coexistence. Their stories were ligaments that let his strategy flex without snapping. The best of them did not flatter the enemy. They humanized him until killing became a last argument rather than an opening statement. "If you cannot imagine a peace with a man," one said, "you will never know when you have one." The summons to smaller campaigns came and went, as seasons do. Skirmishes along roads that thought themselves unimportant until steel reminded them they were famous. Negotiations over towers that believed their stones eternal until ink proved otherwise. Yusuf rode where he was told and returned with what was asked, not only the visible trophies of compliance, but the invisible ones, the absence of resentment, the absence of children taught to hate a name because their fathers were humiliated by a title. He began to understand the arithmetic he would one day rely on: subtract humiliation, add time, multiply mercy, and you can divide a war by seasons until it is small enough to be carried, not dragged. Discipline shaped him without turning him into a disciplinarian. He kept his prayers on time and his temper on a leash. He listened to men who disagreed not to erode them, but to locate the part of their fear that could be employed instead of flattered. Authority, he learned, is not the right to be obeyed, it is the obligation to be worthy of obedience. That difference saves cities. It also breaks the hearts of vain men, which is a lesser tragedy than many suppose. The rumor of Egypt began to bloom at the edges of council like a fragrant obligation. Fatimid Cairo, rich, complicated, quarrelsome with itself, a palace of mirrors that sometimes forgot which version of its face was true. It needed a hand steady enough to guide and gentle enough to stay. In hallways where strategy walked with modest shoes, Nur al-Din's counselors weighed the costs of sending force and the costs of sending character. They looked at Yusuf the way builders look at a timber that has never split under weight. It is a difficult compliment, to be recognized as someone upon whom other men's futures may safely rest. Before the road south was chosen for him, Damascus set one last examination. A dispute, land and water and honor all tangled, that old three-headed animal, threatened to make two neighborhoods into training grounds for orphanhood. Men had already boiled their grievances down to slogans. The air was ready to catch fire because words had been dried for kindling by pride. Yusuf walked the line between them without guards. He asked the farmers to show him where thirst begins in a field. He asked the merchants to show him where bankruptcy begins in a ledger. He made both groups listen while the other answered. Then, without trumpet, he moved a boundary stone the width of a palm and decreed that this, henceforth, would be the measure, not the map a grandfather remembered, but the river the grandson would need. There was protest. There is always protest when the future is invited to correct the dead. He did not answer with soldiers. He answered with predictability. The water will run this way every seventh night. The market will forgive this tax for those weeks when the river fails. The elders will read the river's level at dawn and post it on the mosque door. He built a ritual where men had wanted revenge, and rituals are how a city instructs itself not to burn down every time the sun gets tired. Only after the anger found chairs did he go to the baths, where steam washes the armor off voices. There, between the hiss of poured water and the quiet of loosened joints, two leaders of the quarrel finally admitted they envied each other's wound. each wanted the respect pain can command. He smiled, not unkindly, and said, "Let me give you a wound you can share, responsibility." He appointed them together over the sluice that would manage the water they had nearly fought over to extinction. They left carrying keys rather than grudges. It does not always work like this. But sometimes it must, or else a city becomes a school for widows. When the letter arrived, to go south, to unwrap Egypt from the bandages of its own quarrels, he prayed longer that evening, not for victory, but for a memory that would not abandon him when triumph tempted him to forget the lanes of Damascus. He promised the city silently to export its best habit, the refusal to be hurried into cruelty. Then he walked to the orchard walls and placed his hand on old stone, as a man greets an elder whose advice he will be carrying far. Stone remembers what men forget, that patience is not an action, it is architecture. He did not sleep much the night before departure. He recited to himself the names of those who had instructed him without knowing they were doing so, a guard who begged for fewer orders and more clarity, a scholar who scolded him for briskness with a line of poetry that felt like a kiss, a mother who had asked him once, gently, whether mercy was a habit he intended to keep even when men called it weakness. He said yes to her in the dark again, because it is wise to renew vows in solitude. At dawn, Damascus did what cities do when they are generous. It let him go without theatrics. The gates opened like good sentences. The road gathered under his horse without complaint. Behind him lay a school that had made restraint a muscle rather than a mood. Ahead lay a revered kingdom that would test whether that muscle could carry crowns without shaking. If you stood on the wall as he vanished into heat, you might have imagined you heard a lion's breath learning its cadence, not the pant of hunger, not the growl of vanity, but the steady exhale of a creature preparing to guard rather than to gorge. He would be praised for victories the impatient could count. He would be loved, eventually, for victories that could not be tallied, children who did not become orphans, stones that did not learn the taste of blood, a city that kept its orchards when it might have kept only its grief. You do not learn to fly by staring at the sky. You learn by trusting the wind you cannot see. Southward, the roads widened into rumor, and the rumor was Egypt. Palaces glittering like arguments, factions nested within factions like small knives inside larger velvet. The Nile drew a green sentence across the desert, and insisted on being read correctly, season after season, whether princes quarreled or not. It is a stern tutor, that river. It praises only those who arrive on time. Yusuf rode with men who had learned the price of speed and the price of delay. Scouts stitched horizons to the column with their coming and going. Couriers left and reappeared like commas in a long prayer. The dunes watched as dunes do, without contempt, storing every hoofprint as a footnote against future arrogance. A hawk kept pace high above, not domesticated, only companionable, circling in patient ellipses, as if reminding the column that height is not hunger, and that to see farther is not the same as to rush. Letters preceded them into Cairo the way scents precede a kitchen, some true, some theatrical. A child caliph, Alid, sat among intrigues like a lily floating in careful currents others had arranged. Viziers measured their lives in whisper lengths. Gold learned men's names the way rain learns the names of alleys, by frequent visitation. Each corridor stored the memory of last year's promise, last month's betrayal, last night's toast to an alliance both sides expected to outlive by dawn. Arrive like water, Nur Alden's counsel had advised, and like water choose your bed. So they entered without display, a patient arithmetic of presence. Yusuf measured doorways and faces, the elastic of courtesies, the temperature at which smiles hardened into policy. He learned the palaces map the way a physician learns a pulse, where it skipped, where it raced, where it lied. He made no enemies quickly. The palace had a surplus of those. He made habits instead, regular audiences, predictable stipends, soldiers paid on time, petitions answered with the dignity of punctuality. Cairo noticed. It is a city that remembers how men treat mornings. The first crisis arrived not with trumpet but with bread. The grain barges were late. The Nile's gift had been modest. Accountants had been creative where they ought to have been dull. Archets fidgeted. Bakers rehearsed the angle of refusal. Soldiers grew attentive to the rumors of other soldiers. Yusuf did not summon fear to do the work of discipline. He sent boats upstream with orders to measure distance by hunger, not by map, and to return before rumor outpaced them. He seized no ovens. He seized the story, posted rations by neighborhood, named the river reader who would testify at dawn to the level of water, paid bakers in advance for loaves promised rather than loaves baked. He turned panic into scheduling. The city exhaled, not with joy, but with relief, the more durable climate. Meanwhile the court pressed its smaller wars into his palms, each presented as the only jar worth filling. He refused to break his hands. He lifted a single vessel, stability. Rival emirs tested his patience the way children test a bridge, by leaping against the rail and listening for music. He denied them the song. He answered slight with accuracy, not injury. He answered insult with attention to something measurable, supply lines, garrison drills, the plain mathematics of payroll that turns mercenaries into citizens by steady coin. Character is the slowest weapon. It is also the one most difficult to parry. Then came the sea. From the west, ships like clenched teeth wrote threats onto the horizon. From the east, other flags argued they had arrived first. Ports are mirrors that make distant quarrels intimate. A Frankish flotilla anchored heavy with confidence and lumber, its decks arranged for the ceremony of inevitability. Yusuf went to the walls, not to be seen but to see. He did not ask what the enemy loved, glory, noise, their own courage. He asked what the enemy feared, delay, mud, a wind that would turn their masts into questions, an ally who would arrive neither early enough to boast nor late enough to blame. He sent small fires to the edges of their certainty, skirmishes that burnt like warnings, riders who appeared like punctuation and vanished like prudence, letters to towns behind them urging taxes of patience on any army that needed fodder or guides. He did not meet them where they were strongest. He taught them the price of persistence. When they advanced, the ground he had chosen behaved like an accomplice. Wet where their stride preferred dust, narrow where their pride preferred banners. They called it craft. He called it subtraction again, the removal of easy options. In the palace, a quieter battle, the boy Caliph's caretakers wrapped him in ceremony so thick that intention struggled to breathe. Yusuf knelt as protocol demanded and spoke as necessity required, not loud, not flattering, a clarity that left no shadow for rumor to hide inside it. "We will keep you safe," he said, which in palaces sometimes means, "We will keep the city safe from the mistakes others might make in your name." The child understood in the way children understand weather. He looked toward the men who fed him and saw which faces relaxed. A man may borrow legitimacy from a child if he pays for it with predictability. Yusuf paid on time. He reformed the barracks not by shouting about honor but by making honor practical. Pay on the same day, every month. Training, at the same hour, every morning. Punishment, shallow and quick, never theatrical, as if the law were more embarrassed than angry. He replaced bribes with wages and gossip with rosters. He audited the stables like a man who once learned to read hills by their shoulders. Which horses were wind, which were stone, which were vanity made flesh. He kept the wind, spared the stone, sold the vanity. The treasury complained and then thanked him. It is the custom of treasuries to do both. Not all resistance was refined. A faction, dressed in the courage that failure lends to men with nothing else to wear, attempted to buy the loyalty of a garrison captain whose poverty had become eloquent. The man brought the offer to Yusuf as a confession and a test. "If I refuse, I cannot feed my sister's children," he said. "If I accept, I cannot feed my own name." The reply was simple coin set upon a table and a longer courtesy set upon the man's shoulders. Command of the same post, with oversight as a brother, not a jailer. He obeyed with relief rather than with fear. Relief is more obedient. Cairo began to alter its breath. Markets opened their lungs a little wider. Petitioners learned the angle at which to bow before words would rise to meet them. The child caliph began to smile as children do when adults have stopped making the room a court and started making it a house. There were victories for the impatient to admire, raids that returned with trophies, ships that turned away after losing arguments with wind and mathematics. But the truer victories walked without music, neighborhoods that did not learn a new curse, mothers who did not memorize a new widow's etiquette, boys who learned to yawn at the rumor of emergency. Across the year's hinge, a letter arrived from the north like a hand placed on a shoulder from behind, Nur al-Din's script, spare and exact. The message was neither leash nor trumpet. It was a question shaped like trust. Could Egypt stand without borrowing cruelty? Could it contribute to a future in which Jerusalem would be approached like a wound to be closed rather than a jewel to be displayed? Yusuf read the letter twice and answered without ink, by building the kind of order that would not need to be defended with theater. On a dusk that had been kind to roofs and patient with birds, he climbed the citadel and watched the hawk again, circling, choosing, delaying, then plunging with a certainty that was almost tender in its precision. He understood then what the bird had been teaching all along, to make speed at the last moment, and only then, to let waiting accumulate into a single decisive line, to refuse any strike that would leave the field unfit for the next season's seed. There is a way to win that harvest, only victory, and a way to win that harvest, the future. He resolved to be a farmer among generals. The court still had its masks. The city still had its thieves. The river still had its moods. But the falcon in him had found a wind it trusted, and the men who rode under his quiet had begun to arrange their days by a clock more faithful than ambition, competence. Egypt, difficult, luminous, a chessboard that sometimes pretended to be a mirror, had not changed its nature for him. He had changed the terms by which it could be strong. And from the walls, when the night thinned and the first call braided the roofs together, Cairo sounded less like a prize and more like a promise. A promise to become the staging ground not for vengeance, but for a correction long deferred. The hawk settled on an unseen perch. Below, a city slept without rehearsing panic. A crown is not only hammered metal, it is the sum of expectations placed upon a single human spine. Cairo brought him such a crown, not jeweled, not shouted, but composed of errands and dawns and the unglamorous grammar of keeping a multitude from breaking into smaller multitudes. The city asked to be shepherded without being shorn. It asked to be guarded without being frightened by its guard. It asked the impossible, and in asking, revealed what people mean when they say, "Lead us, give form to our hope without stealing our faces." Morning taught the lesson first. In the precincts near the palace, where the stone kept old oaths with shade, petitioners formed a river of small urgencies. A widow with the eyes of someone who had learned arithmetic from hunger brought a parchment with rents unpaid since a flood had argued with her street. A mason, hands still dusty with the history held inside mortar, begged the city to forgive his son's impatience with a knife. A merchant whose ledger could have been a royal chronicle, so intricate were its wars against loss, asked for a judgment against a partner whose ambition had outrun his honesty. Yusuf listened, and then he lengthened the city's stride by one practical step. He made the first hour of his day a house with an open door. Those who could not afford to wait in courtyards waited in that hour instead. The practice cost him sleep, which he paid, and it purchased from the people a kind of affection that does not applaud, it obeys. He had inherited soldiers who could terrify but not always defend, scribes who could decorate a lie until it resembled policy, and nobles who had grown used to treating the city as a mother who would never say no to her sons. He answered each with a rearrangement of time. The guard changed watches to align with prayer, not with convenience, an old trick that turns piety into punctuality. The scribes were given tables in the light, where ink behaves better because it knows it is visible. The nobles were invited, quietly, privately, to contribute to repairs the flood had left unfinished, and the invitations were accompanied by an accounting so accurate that refusing would require a man to insult his future reputation to his future grandchildren. A few tried. They found themselves thanked in public anyway, and generosity trapped them in its pleasant cage. The old Fatimid machinery whirred, each will jealous of its neighbor. Cemeteries of intrigue had been built within the palace. Yet a crown of mercy cannot be worn as costume. It must be earned in moments when punishment would be applauded. A captain brought before him a thief, trembling less from fear than from the kind of exhaustion that erases a man's name. The tale was brief, a loaf snatched, a chase through an alley that remembered other chases, a confession with salt but no theater. Cut the hand. one elder said too quickly, as if the law were a drum to be beaten for rhythm rather than a measure to be read with care. Yusuf asked the baker, "What did this cost you?" The man, surprised by the exactness of the question, answered with numbers, not rage. Then Yusuf asked the thief, "What hunger has cost you your shame?" The man answered with a sister's fever and a mother's debt, and a winter's thinness that had stretched into spring like bad news left unresolved. The judgment was mercy disguised as mathematics. The palace paid the baker thrice the cost. The thief worked in the bakery for a season with wages to be sent to his family. The captain who caught him was given the pride of supervision and the burden of teaching. No hands were lost. Reputation was preserved. The alley learned a new ending for an old story. The elder who had been quick to shout the law nodded, not humiliated but relieved that the text had remembered the God for whom it speaks. A drought's rumor tested the city next. The Nile's shoulder had narrowed, and the river reader's staff found shallows where depth belonged. Panic is contagious in a river kingdom. Men tighten their fists around grain as if clenching might be a spell. Speculators perform the arithmetic of cruelty. Fear invents profits. Yusuf answered with a ritual, as he had in Damascus, a calendar of release from hoarding, inspection of granaries by elders chosen for their dull honesty, and public accounting of reserves read aloud after prayer as if the figures themselves were a kind of supplication. He appointed a woman, Sid Zainab, whose name lived already in the markets as someone too busy to be flattered, to oversee distribution. Those who wished to complain were directed to her, and many arrived armed with their boldness. They left carrying sacks and instruction and the peculiar gratitude that disciplines as it feeds. "He hides behind a woman," a courtier sneered in private. "He trusts a city," Yusuf answered in public, and Cairo remembered. Mercy in a ruler draws daggers from cowards and allegiance from the brave. The former arrived as a midnight plot, clumsy and cruel, a bribe offered to a stable boy to poison the horse's trough, a bribe doubled by the stable boy's pride when he presented it to his master instead. The boy asked for no reward. He asked for a chance to apprentice with the farrier whose hands made iron obedient. "You will have both," Yusuf said, and then, because generosity is a lesson most vivid when taught near its opposite, he took the conspirator's purse not for the treasury but for the mosque that kept a school for fatherless boys. The city felt the shape of the story and approved without clamor. The courtier who had arranged the plot fled into a rumor that soon forgot him. This is another mercy, to grant your enemies only a past. News from the sea moved like a bruise, ships testing Alexandria's patience, envoys whose smiles bore too many teeth. Yusuf went north to watch the coast relearn its courage. He did not unleash some theatrical defense. He taught the harbor a habit. Pilots were trained to read weather as if it were a ledger. Patrols were made small and frequent rather than grand and rare. The lighthouse became a school as much as a sentinel, where boys climbed to learn what distances do to honesty. When a raid came, it found no performance to disrupt, only competence. The enemy left with the disappointment of actors denied an audience, a most efficient victory. Back in Cairo, a fever visited. Flies grew insolent. The city's breath shortened. The physicians argued decorously. humors and prayers, poultices and isolation. Yusuf entered the quarrel as one enters a sick room, without noise. He ordered water boiled and distributed. He opened the mosque courtyards to serve as clinics. He commanded that the poor be treated first because rich men can afford to wait with their pride. He paid the gravediggers more than the scribes for a time, which is the kind of sentence that makes a court uneasy because it is true. The fever lifted as fevers do, steadily, then all at once, and the city found itself grateful without quite knowing to whom. Gratitude is healthiest when it has no single address. A letter came from Nur al-Din, thinner this time, as if written by a man economizing not ink but breath. The old master praised nothing. He inquired after everything: the arsenal's state, the judge's honesty, the imam's caution against becoming drums for unripe wars. He asked in a postscript, small script for a large hope, whether Cairo was now a house where the word, Jerusalem, could be spoken without waking demons in men's eyes. Yusuf read the line twice, and the hawk within him turned once in a wide arc. Not yet, he thought. But soon, if the river holds, if the children do not learn new cursing songs, if the nobles grow tired of being thanked for duties. Cairo had begun to love him, which is dangerous for a city because love can become laziness. He guarded himself against it by polishing the only mirror that does not flatter, service. He walked markets without proclamation and bought what he did not need to hear prices spoken without fear. He watched scribes cut quills and asked whether their fingers ached, and what that ache taught them about governance. He visited a school and listened to boys mispronounce the names of far cities and refused to correct them, because ambition should first be allowed to be noisy. He sat with a judge who had grown brittle with the tax of being the city's conscience, and told him a joke so gentle that it felt like a prayer. The judge wept a little. Men who weep a little make better laws. Then the palace asked him to perform a cruelty that would have cost him nothing but would have bought him applause. To parade prisoners taken in a night's operation, men who had been trained by arrogance to believe that noise is a right. He refused the parade. He questioned each man and divided them into the categories by which a city repairs itself: the dangerous, who must learn silence in a place with walls; the misled, who must be returned to their mothers to endure a discipline more efficient than iron; the hungry, who must be employed; and the proud, who must be ignored until neglect eats their costume. He freed more than he kept. Officers worried. Crime did not rise. It turned out that the city had been waiting not for a spectacle but for someone to begin measuring things it already understood to be measurable: intentions, capacities, the likely futures of particular men. Atop the citadel one evening, the sky wearing that particular late gold that makes rooftops confess their cracks, he thought of crowns again. Of the old kind, heavy, jealous, loud, and of the new kind he was fashioning, dust and mercy, schedules and grain, water read every dawn by hands that trusted the staff to tell the truth even when men did not. He thought of the boy Caliph who played with carved lions in a courtyard and of the lions waiting beyond the desert, whose roar was a trumpet for wars wrapped in scripture. He asked himself the only question that matters to a man who has begun to collect other men's futures: what must I not break in order to win? The answer arrived like the hawk's shadow slipping over the city's shoulder. Do not break the habit of restraint. Do not break the grammar by which mercy becomes law. Do not break the children's expectation that tomorrow will look like today except for its new sunlight. Do not break the river's trust that men will not order them backward. Keep these, and you may spend victories without going bankrupt. Word came that the old master in the north had closed his eyes. Nur al-Din, that spine of winter, gone into the quiet he had always deserved. Grief traveled through the camp like a hand pressing posts to test their depth. Many shook. Yusuf did not. He bowed, inwardly, to a grave he would not see, and he accepted the inheritance that cannot be named in documents, the obligation to keep ambition yoked to usefulness. Men began to ask questions with their glances they had been too shy to voice when the great man breathed. Would Egypt be content to be a garden? Would Cairo be content to be a kitchen? Or would the patient lion at last turn his face toward the name that had been practicing in the mouths of prayers since before he was a boy, Al-Quds? He gave no answer in proclamations. He gave answers to roads. Caravans were told that their safety would be guaranteed if they declared their weights honestly. Blacksmiths were given iron that did not lie. Imams were gently asked to preach about widows for a month, the holiness of guarding them, the shame of forgetting them, so that the city's strength would not become a theater for men only. And when diplomats arrived with eyes that wanted to see the future before it happened, he offered them tea, not maps. "We are pruning," he said, which is a gardener's way of saying, "We are preparing for fruit." Night by night, the city's pulse began to match the rhythm he had wanted from the first day, competence braided to compassion. Mercy without sloppiness. Order without cruelty. The hawk came less often, as if trusting that the air beneath no longer needed instruction. On those evenings when it did appear, he saluted the bird with a small lift of his chin, a private treaty between a man and a metaphor. A crown of dust and mercy is indistinguishable from a city that sleeps without rehearsing alarms. Cairo slept. And in the sleep of a city, roads dreamed themselves longer, fields dreamed themselves greener, and banners dreamed themselves quieter. It is from such sleep that a people can be woken not into panic but into pilgrimage. Some men imagine kingship as a thunder that lives inside the throat. Others learn, too late, that a crown is merely a mirror that refuses to flatter. In the Latin kingdom, the mirror had been handed to Guy of Lusignan, who searched it for inevitability and found only reflection. He wanted the music of command without the mathematics. He mistook momentum for strategy, applause for obedience, and impatience for courage. Around him, the lords of the cross quarreled over old gravel as if stones could be baptized into better soldiers. Rumor of his temper traveled eastward like smoke that could not decide what it wished to become. It found ears in Cairo where Yusuf, now Salah al-Din not only by name but by the quiet agreement of a people, was practicing the art that terrifies noisy men, restraint. He did not meet smoke with fire. He met it with water, a federation of patience among tribes and schools, Kurds and Arabs, Turks and Egyptians, imams and judges and merchants whose piety was measured in fair weights. He gathered faiths as a gardener gathers varieties, each with its season, each needing different weather, all conspiring toward fruit. In Aleppo and Mosul, in Damascus and Cairo, his messengers moved like arteries, carrying the same sentence in many dialects: we must breathe together or not at all. He wrote to emirs whose pride had taught them thrift with obedience. He sent gifts that were not bribes but recognitions, horses that fit a man's seat the way purpose fits a vow, armor tempered for a specific wrist, books copied for a scholar whose loneliness had become expensive. He invited jurists to argue publicly with commanders so that law would not learn to tremble. He praised poets but paid accountants better. Unity is not a trumpet, it is a daily wage. Across the border, Guy rehearsed indignation until it sounded like policy. His counselors, divided into factions that slept with one eye open and one hand on the table, found in his weakness a flattering utility. Each could claim to be the spine he lacked. Reynold of Chatillon, that caravan's wolf, coached him in the theater of insult, how to make a raid look like a sacrament, how to convert theft into prophecy. Bishops raised relics that had learned to be patient with politics. Knights oiled banners the way some men oil arguments, for frictionless violence. Salah al-Din watched them the way a physician watches a fever that wishes to boast. He gathered not only men but meanings. Sermons braided courage to courtesy. Edicts taught markets to prefer honesty over excitement. The army learned that victory was not a license to humiliate. This was the gathering of faiths, not merely sects and schools reconciled around a map, but capacities married to virtues, archers to restraint, cavalry to timing, generals to laws that would outlive them. He was building a country inside a crossroads. In councils, he spoke little and remembered everything. He placed a hand upon a map and did not press. He let his palm learn the topography while others argued. He wanted the enemy to move first, not from deference, but because movement arranges truth in the open. To men who lobbied for immediate thunder, he offered rain instead, steady heralds sent to cities where old grudges liked to impersonate gods. To skeptics who mistook patience for delay, he gave tasks that measured loyalty, roads to repair, reservoirs to deepen, stores to tally. Ambition learns humility in ledgers. Then Reynold broke the prayer of caravans again. Confiscations baptized as courage, merchants mocked as if peace were an insult only cowardly men enjoy. The news arrived wrapped in women's grief and in men's oaths that tasted of iron. It reached Cairo's courtyards and Damascus's baths. It entered schools and made the ink think of blood. The hawk within Salah al-Din turned once and cast a shadow over his hesitation. Mercy must not become a rumor that bullies learn to spend twice. He summoned his captains. The room smelled of leather and dust, and the clean fear of men who know they may be asked to do something difficult and decent at the same time. He spoke of famine avoided and granaries honest, of tribes who had traded their inertia for allegiance, of judges who had learned to scold the powerful without rehearsing their own courage first. "We are strong," he said, and the sentence did not feel like pride, it felt like an audit. "We will go to the open country and ask God what He loves more, glory's noise or Jerusalem's quiet." The summons went out with the economy of a drumbeat. Columns converged like answer lines moving toward a poem's last stanza. Tents multiplied cautiously on chosen ground. Scouts ranged far and returned with sentences instead of boasts. Water was counted, shade scheduled, hooves spared the hottest hours. In this assembly, men did not shout to display loyalty. They arrived on time and allowed themselves to be arranged by a logic larger than their own. It is a rare thing, and it is why some empires live. Priests blessed armor on the other side of the line. Their liturgy had the mood of betting. Banners practiced looking immortal. Guy, nervous, tried on decisiveness and found it both tight and loose in the wrong places. He announced himself with marches instead of measures. He let the sun teach his men thirst before the enemy had to. He chose a road that flattered maps and betrayed bodies. Counselors warned and were thanked, which is how kings tell the truth to be quiet. The gathering of faiths continued not only in camps but in streets. In Aleppo, a grandmother corrected a boy's slur for a man from the south. "He guards the same prayer as you," she said, "and the same bread." In Cairo, a merchant forgave a hasty debt because the debtor's brother rode north with the army, and parting deserves an interest rate of mercy. In Damascus, a judge dismissed a case brought by a noble against a poor man for having prayed in the wrong courtyard. "This city is a single room," the judge said, and wrote a law that made it so. These small welds stitched a larger armor. On an evening when the wind decided to be generous, Salah al-Din walked the line of tents and asked for nothing theatrical. He tested a girth with 2 fingers. He corrected a picket's angle. He asked a boy his father's name, and repeated it carefully as if storing it for a prayer. Men who had learned to love swagger found themselves loving precision instead. He gave no speech, not because speeches are useless, but because the army already had the only speech it could spend in the morning: readiness. A courier brought news that Guy had accepted bait he believed beneath him even as he swallowed it, a call to relieve Tiberius, framed as an urgent arithmetic. He moved his force into a geography that preferred patience and water to pride and speed. Salah al-Din let the trap be built out of the enemy's habits. He arranged his own around wells and wind and the hawk's private geometry. The moon rehearsed its absence. Fires in the far distance remembered their admirers. The night expanded time for men who could sleep. The impatient did not. There was a prayer before dawn, soft and exact. Not a trumpet, a tuning. Men stood bowed, and were returned to themselves. No one told the sun to climb. It arrived and found 2 armies, one arranged around thirst, the other around promise. The details of the day belonged to another chapter, one with heat like a verdict and banners that learned to fall with dignity. But before that noon, before that famous hill would learn the taste of crowns, the work of this chapter was complete. An army had been gathered that understood itself as a people, and a people had been gathered that understood itself as a vow. Guy stared into the morning and saw what kings see when nerves stop lying, not the enemy, but the cost. He did not lower his gaze. He had not been taught how. Back in the tents behind Salah al-Din, letters waited unwritten for outcomes they would not be required to announce. In them would have been the same sentences that governed all his victories. Do not harvest a hatred you will have to eat later. Do not spend a humiliation that will produce interest in blood. Do not mistake a city's cheer for the city's health. He had trained his hand to these lines until they could be written in the dark. The wind rose. The hawk hung on it without moving. In that stillness of a bird held by an invisible scaffold, you could read the shape of what the day demanded, a patience that ends at the exact inch where mercy would be wasted, a precision that refuses to leave a single future unprotected if it can be saved without teaching arrogance the wrong lessons. This is how nations are gathered, not by shouting a creed, but by teaching a habit and then trusting it to hold when drums begin. The officers returned from their last checks. The water skins were where they ought to be. The horses' eyes were quick without being wild. The archers had counted their arrows and, more importantly, their breaths. Salah al-Din looked once toward the west where the sea hoarded its own stories, and once toward the east where childhood had taught him how to be useful. Then he looked nowhere at all, into that middle distance where a man meets the part of himself he has been building for years without spectacle. Behind him lay a federated patience. Before him, the unraveling of a crown that had mistaken heat for light. Between them moved a day that would teach swords the proper angle of mercy, and teach a world the difference between a conqueror and a caretaker. Dawn unstitched the dark with a needle of pale fire, and the hills around Hattin woke like animals deciding whether to move. Wind brought the smell of thirst before the sun had time to own it. The horns of the twin-crowned hill waited, patient as judges. Between those horns and the lake beyond lay the arithmetic of the day, written not in ink but in dust. Who had water? Who had heat? Who had chosen a road for pride instead of for breath? On the Frankish side, banners tried to invent shade and failed. Armor remembered yesterday's sun and refused to forget. Men swallowed the last comfortable mouthfuls they would taste until evening had either mercy or didn't. Priests lifted relics that glinted like promises and weighed like warnings. Guy listened to counsel the way a man listens to a language he learned late, catching nouns, missing verbs, filling in courage where grammar meant caution. He saw Tiberius as a bell he had to answer. He did not hear the bell's rope burning. Across the field, Salah al-Din's lines breathed in one cadence. The camp had slept not like a village but like a single animal, long ribs lifting, long ribs settling, the night passing through disciplined lungs. No trumpet. A prayer clean as water poured, praise that did not tremble, petition that did not bargain, surrender that did not weaken the hand. The hawk hung above the ground's intent, wings steady, head making the small adjustments that are the whole difference between plunging and floating. Orders moved through the ranks as if the air itself had been taught a route, archers to the edges of impatience, cavalry to the shadows of wells, reserves laid by like a thought you planned to finish at the right sentence. The men did not grin. They closed their fingers around what they had practiced. Nearby, a lad with a beard that still argued with his face checked his arrows twice, then checked his breath, and found both in number. When the first arrows spoke, they spoke in the old dialect, thin, fast, exact. Not a scream, not a boast, an instruction. They taught the enemy to keep his head low, to use his shield in a way that made thirst angrier, to collapse his formation by inches into confusion's grammar. Horses stamped, and were steadied by hands that remembered how to steady even when shoulders asked to flee the sun. Salah al-Din watched, and did not touch the day too early. command is largely the art of leaving a right thing alone. Guy pushed forward because forward was the only word his mouth trusted. The slope judged him for it without ceremony. Men tried to climb heat as if heat were a hill. Smoke, set not to terrify but to persuade, leaned toward their noses and turned breath into attacks. Water skins became rumor. Rumor became panic, eager to be useful. Knights who had once loved the straightness of charges found their lines curving into the inevitable shape of men who have been led by thirst instead of by maps. From the right, cavalry kissed the edge and vanished, kissed again, vanished again, teaching the Franks to spend anger without changing the purchase. From the left, Duss wrote a sentence the enemy misread as escape and followed only to be corrected by terrain. The horns of Hattin did what horns do, they pointed and impaled. Between them, the day reached for noon and found it with a ruthless accuracy. There is a tempo at which battles confess their outcomes before they are over. You hear it not in a shout but in the silence between shouts, the moment when men realize they are arguing with heat and angle and habit, and that none of these learn new languages in time. Salah al-Din felt that tempo arrive and tighten only one strap, the one that holds mercy to victory so victory does not wander into appetite. He sent riders not to chase, but to herd, not to scatter, but to fold, not to humiliate, but to finish. The true cross, weight of wood and centuries, was lifted and the sun punished whoever loved it too closely. A flight of arrows stitched the air around it, and taught the bearers how to kneel. The banner fell without blasphemy. It rested like a tired pilgrim. The cry that went up was not godless. It was human, a sound men make when the story they brought to the day loses its title. Guy's tent appeared like a thought that refuses to admit it is late. He stood there with the look of someone who has finally read the sentence the terrain had been writing all morning. Reynold, glared at the world as if betrayal were a climate. They were taken, not in pageantry, but in the way a storm takes a hat, simply because the wind has decided. Elsewhere across the field, men yielded and were gathered. Some tried to die more beautifully than they had lived, others tried to live more carefully than they had fought. The ground cooled a little as the dust settled, as if approving the end of a struggle that had lacked manners. Water was brought to prisoners according to a rule older than war and newer than pride. A boy who had practiced killing with eloquence now practiced handing cups without shaking. He would dream of both motions for years and be healed by neither until he fell in love with a woman who disliked swords and told better stories about bread. In the victor's pavilion, the defeated king drank and, in the mercy of that cup, remembered he was a man before he was a title. Salah al-Din offered water as a judge offers a precedent, so that the next sentence will know where to stand. Guy drank. The cup went to Reynold and was stopped. "You gave me your word," the Sultan said to the king. "Not him." A line drawn, not with rage, with law. The old wolf had torn caravans across oaths as if vows were textiles meant for ripping. There are debts history refuses to renegotiate. Judgment came swift and exact. Cold steel answered years of heat. The tent learned the shape of quiet that follows a lesson finally taught. Outside, captives were counted like responsibilities, not like trophies. Officers found shade for men who could not find it for themselves. The wounded on both sides were treated by hands that had never asked whom a man prayed to before they closed a wound. There are victories ugly enough to make orphans out of the victor's sons. Hattin refused that ugliness because restraint had been written into the mourning. Word ran the ridgelines, then the roads, then the towns, Hattin. The name moved with the speed of a sentence that changes the tense of history. Markets learned it by noon, mothers by afternoon, imams and priests by evening. The news did not teach gloating where Salah al-Din's letters reached first. He wrote of thanksgiving and fasting, of alms for widows on both sides, of a discipline that would have to be harder now because triumph invites sloppiness disguised as joy. As the sun at last released its grip and the field exhaled, the Sultan stood on a rise and studied the shape of what remained. Shields looking like fallen moons. But even as the earth shook at predictable hours, camp discipline forbade that other, more dangerous shaking, the tremor of appetites inflamed by nearness to triumph. Water was rationed with a justice that made rumor boring. Prayers kept time. The poor of the besiegers ate before the proud. When a soldier's anger outpaced his orders, his pay paused until his temper remembered its leash. Mercy is not a feeling, it is a schedule. Inside the walls, the choice sharpened. Some urged a last theater of blood, as if the city could be saved by a performance of ruin. Mothers argued for futures. Priests and imams and rabbis, each in his room, found the same ancient plea in different tongues: let the innocent live. And so, while engines counted down inevitability, human voices arranged a path for surrender that would not teach children to hate the name of God. The gates opened, not flung wide by a tide of iron, but unlatched by agreement. Banners entered like grammar, not like thunder. There was no parade of mockery, no procession of forced abasement. Guards posted to doorways were given a single instruction: keep panic from inventing itself. Those who chose exile were escorted to the roads, their goods intact, their dignity unbroken. Crowds move like weather, dignity gives them better wind. In the precincts of the holy places, dust lifted and settled as it has always done under the sandals of the devout. Salah al-Din walked where the past had often been misused. He did not stride, he arrived. He ordered that sanctuaries be clean not for conquest but for prayer. He refused the stagecraft of desecration. He banned drunken victory and cheap revenge with the same signature. Those who had feared a second burning learned a quieter arithmetic. A city given back to worship instead of offered to appetite. Ransom, that blunt instrument, became a ledger of conscience. Those unable to pay were not automatically condemned to chains. The treasury balanced the account by choice and by story. A widow with 3 children and a face memorized by rain found her debt erased. A craftsman whose hands had built doors for both mosque and church was repaid by the gates he had once carved. A priest who carried an empty purse but a full list of names bought freedom with memory. It was accepted as currency. In the narrow lanes, gratitude learned to walk without shouting. Not all men can bear mercy. There were mutterings that justice had been diluted, that triumph wasted itself upon kindness. Salah al-Din answered the only way that convinces the heart of heart, by making order predictably merciful. Courts sat, thieves were punished in proportion, not in theater. Soldiers who tried to take advantage of confusion found the law swift and uninterested in their excuses. A city learns what to expect from its new masters by how the first 2 weeks are run. Jerusalem learned punctuality and restraint. From the ramparts at dusk, the hills breathed out their heat, and the city exhaled the fear it had been forced to hold for years. Cries that would have summoned slaughter in other seasons summoned account keepers and guides. The market's voice returned, a murmur of weights and measures, the liturgy of ordinary life. Children stared at uniforms and learned, to their surprise, that uniforms could pass without taking anything. It is a profound education. In a chamber looking upon the courtyards, the Sultan read letters that would travel farther than any soldier. To Damascus, he wrote of thanksgiving and vigilance, instructing that alms be distributed for widows on both sides, that poets curb their tongues from gloating, that jurists remember victory cannot rewrite revelation. To Cairo, he wrote of sobriety, secure the granaries, forgive a portion of tax where harvests had been troubled, send physicians north to tend the displaced. To Aleppo and Mosul, he wrote the line he trusted most. We have opened a door. Walk through it gently. He visited the places men turn into mirrors, wells where women talk, markets where labor judges wealth, and listened for rumor. It came, but slowly, and without its usual teeth. He corrected a price, not by decree, but by example, paying exact coin for wheat and leaving the line longer than when he joined it. He stopped at a school and asked the teacher to recite not war tales, but the story of how treaties get written. The children grew restless, as children must, and then quiet again when they realized the story ended with sleep and bread and no fires. Let them be bored by peace, he thought. Boredom is a pillow the future can share. When Friday came, and with it the gathered breath of thousands, he asked the Katib to praise gratitude and warn against arrogance dressed as piety. Do not become what you despise, the sermon said, lest you lose what you have reclaimed. On Sunday, bells were allowed their hour. On Saturday, markets kept the Sabbath calm out of decency rather than decree. Plural sanctity is fragile. It requires a choreography of small permissions, rehearsed daily until they become custom. Night after night, the hawk rode a dark circle above roofs that had survived too many ages of certainty. Below, lamps multiplied not like stars but like promises. Here a widow has bread. Here a child has water. Here a shop has reopened. Here a guard returns a lost trinket to a fleeing family and accepts no coin. The city took note. Cities always do. They repay memory with legitimacy, the only tender that outlasts flags. Yet even victories well spent cast long obligations. Borders do not forget how to be jealous. Kings do not forget how to covet. Faiths do not forget how to harden when frightened. From the north came the rumor of a lion in winter whose pilgrimage would be made in steel. From the sea came ships that wished to rename the coast. From within, the usual appetites stirred, the small men who prefer drama to duty, the courtiers who mistake proximity to power for power. Jerusalem had been opened, it would now have to be kept. Salah al-Din stood at a terrace where the night rose easily and thought of doors. The kind that slam, the kind that swing, the kind you hold for another because you are not in a hurry to be first. He chose, again, the last kind. He sent writers to fortify roads rather than rumors, engineers to strengthen wells rather than slogans, judges to travel circuits where habit could begin to govern without supervision. He instructed that prisoners be exchanged in good faith where possible, so that the next war, if it must come, would know it was being fought by men, not by appetites. He slept little. Stewards do not sleep much when roofs are new to their hands. But when he did, he dreamed not of the day's applause, nor of the city's silhouette, nor even of the hill where noon had been a verdict. He dreamed of a child somewhere, years from now, who would not know the smell of panic, who would yawn through a sermon about mercy because mercy had become ordinary. That is the secret hope of every worthy conqueror, that his deeds become invisible, replaced by customs that do the work without his name. Outside, before dawn, the muezzin's call braided calmly with the city's other silences. The voice did not claim the morning, it invited it. Gates, newly taught, opened on hinges that remembered not to scream. Swords rested. Doors did as doors should, they made way. Victory is a teacher with two voices. One is loud and generous, promising that tomorrow will obey the same courage that mastered today. The other is quiet and exacting, reminding that the dead do not attend parades and that banners, if left unaccompanied by bread and justice, become curtains between rulers and their duty. In the months after Jerusalem's doors learned to open without screaming, Salah al-Din walked between those voices and chose, again and again, the quieter one. Letters multiplied. They arrived with wax still warm, with sand still in their folds, carrying requests that wore the costumes of necessities, garrisons asking for timber as if timbers were prayers, judges asking for soldiers as if verdicts could march, merchants asking for monopolies as if the river would be grateful for a dam. He answered each with a memory of the city he had promised to keep, open roads, honest scales, sanctuaries protected not for their usefulness but for their sacredness. The pen in his hand did not strut. It tallied. Graves, meanwhile, did the work they always do after a famous noon. They made the world smaller and heavier for particular families. Mothers taught themselves new routes to market that avoided the sight of certain hills. Boys who had pretended to battle with sticks learned to carry water without spilling. A widow in Acre counted coins given by strangers and decided which part of her dignity to spend today and which to save for tomorrow. Salah al-Din visited none of these houses. He ordered stipends instead, steady and unadorned, the kind that do not force gratitude to rehearse. He insisted that the clerks who carried the coins learn the names of the households they served. "You are not delivering money," he said. "You are delivering a promise that noon will not devour evening." In the camps along the coast, banners practiced the art of surviving wind. The Franks, chastened, stunned, but not erased, regrouped under leaders who measured futures in steel and weather. Out of the west came a rumor sharpening into a person, a king whose name had once been a metaphor for daring and would now become a scarcity of sleep: Richard. Men whispered of a lion crossing the water, and the desert, which loves symbols but trusts distances more, waited to be convinced. Preparation is the politest form of fear. Ports were strengthened so that ships could be greeted with competence rather than theater. Along the roads from Damascus to the sea, way stations were repaired and posted with men who had learned to prefer reporting to boasting. Engineers, the quiet priests of survival, measured walls with tapped knuckles and listened like doctors. Water, that oldest ally, was read and portioned and persuaded to be loyal. The army drilled not louder, only steadier, like a heart that refuses to be panicked into arrhythmia by rumor. Between these labors moved an obligation harder than any siege, keeping victory from becoming a habit of cruelty. In the markets of Jerusalem, a dispute rose between a butcher and a pilgrim over the price of meat the pilgrim swore had been promised lower the day before. Small, contemptible to military minds, and therefore sacred to any ruler who remembers what a city truly is. The judge assigned to the quarter had grown thin with cases and short with temper. Salah al-Din sat with him beneath an awning that smelled faintly of cumin and rain. "Your voice is a bridge," he said. "Some days you will carry carts. Most days you will carry feet. The bridge that despises feet collapses when carts arrive." The judge bowed without humiliation. He recognized advice that would save his spine. Supply trains moved under stars that kept their appointments. In one column, a boy of 17 carried a jar of oil with the concentration other boys saved for poetry. He had painted upon it the name of a brother lost at Hattin. The jar reached a garrison kitchen and became bread and light. No song was written about it. Not all victories have the dignity of being ignored by minstrels. Envoys from cities that had survived under Latin banners came to test the new grammar of rule. Some came with sincerity, some came with rehearsed injury looking for an audience. To each the Sultan offered the same reassurance disguised as inconvenience. Law that would not change with a governor's mood. Taxes that would be counted openly enough to be resented honestly, worship protected in proportion to its humility. "Arrogance," he said more than once, "is not a faith. It is a weather. We will prefer climate." News of Richard hardened from rumor to arrival. Acre, bruised and stubborn, became the stage upon which both sides performed their seriousness. The siege there was a furnace into which courage and suffering were fed on both sides until courage and suffering were indistinguishable. Salah al-Din rode the ridges and read the city's endurance, as one reads a candle. How much wax remains, how clean the flame, how steady the hand that shields it from draughts. He sent relief again and again, not as gestures but as proofs. Columns sent like sentences, each composed to be understood by the terrible grammar of arrows and ladders. Between battles, he practiced the diplomacy of fatigue. Letters carried across narrow corridors of truce asked for exchanges of prisoners, for the return of bodies, for hours in which the wounded could be collected from between the lines without the lines trying to recruit them into death. Sometimes the letters were honored, sometimes not. He persisted, not out of naivety, but out of stubborn instruction. Teach even enemies to obey a habit that will spare the next generation at least a few graves. There were failures that clung to him like thorns. A convoy he could not save because wind and distance conspired. A fortress that fell because a ladder was placed where a ladder should never have found courage. A promise delayed by a stomach sickness that arrived at the worst hour. He recorded these in the ledger no one read, the one that taught him how not to blame the moon for tides. He paid for them with adjustments, not with self-reproach turned into theater. Around the fires at night, soldiers told stories that did not always flatter their commanders. In healthier armies, this is a sacrament. Laughter varnished fear, exaggeration clothed embarrassment. Once, passing without escort, he heard his own name mangled into a rustic joke about a sultan who counts grain by individual kernels. He smiled in the shadows. "Let them think me stingy," he whispered to the hawk-shaped silence above. "Economy will keep their children fat." Winter visited the coast with knives hidden in its rain. Mud learned new ways to humiliate men. Rations thinned and tempers thickened. Salah al-Din answered with the only luxury that never bankrupts a camp: fairness. He reduced his own table conspicuously, delayed entertainments that had learned to pull rank, and ordered that clerks eat with the men whose names they mispronounced when paying them. Few orders are so efficient at erasing contempt. The pilgrims who stayed in Jerusalem began to write letters home with a tone the city had not heard in years, a tone that combined awe with relief. They described processions that did not require their neighbor's silence, markets that did not compel a stranger's humiliation, judges who listened long enough to grow weary but not cynical. These letters moved outward like climate change, subtle but cumulative. Not everyone believed them. Not everyone needed to. The letter's work was to make hatred harder to arrange. Then came a day of graves that outnumbered banners, acres surrendered, and what should have been ritual exchange and mercy collapsed into a cruelty not of his making. Prisoners, souls with mothers and letters and small wooden toys hidden in their packs, were slain in a theater of vengeance. Rage ran through the ranks like a fire looking for a dryness to own. Men demanded mirrors of blood. Salah al-Din stood before that mirror and refused his reflection. He buried the dead, his and theirs, with the same geometry, and he swore a vow that sounds like weakness to the hurried, to let discipline, not appetite, choose his answers. He struck where he must, but never where grief asked him to spend beyond wisdom. Between banners and graves, ambassadors continued to cross the spaces between camps like stitches trying to make fabric from wounds. With Richard, letters grew into meetings, a chess of words between two men the world wanted to mythologize into opposites. There was steel in each, but of different tempers. They found in each other not friends, but the relief of competence, a mutual impatience for fools, a grudging admiration for the other's refusal to rehearse falsehoods. Talk did not end war, but it taught limits to cruelty, hours to breath, seasons to hope. Inside his tent, when the lamps were trimmed and the last ledger closed, Salah al-Din returned to the only court that never lies, the one in which a man judges his own intentions. He asked himself whether ambition had secretly learned to enjoy the smell of incense more than the smell of bread, whether the law had become an instrument for keeping his name polished rather than the city safe, whether boys could safely become men under the habits he was building. When he found answers that frightened him, he corrected them the next day, not with proclamations, but with schedules and salaries and the placing of quiet men in loud jobs. Spring rehearsed itself along the roads, green attempting its stubborn argument against armor. Truces came and went, as truces do when the sea keeps delivering more certainty with swords. He accepted them when they served breath, refused them when they insulted it. Somewhere in the weave of seasons and sieges, the story the world would remember was arranging its climax. He could feel it in the way the hawks circled lower, in the way letters arrived with less perfume and more dust, in the way his captains began to speak with the impatience of men who prefer endings to continuations. But between banners and graves lives the country he had always meant to found, a place where the law's face is steady, where prayer does not become a hammer, where markets learn to disobey panic, where a widow's name can halt a general's signature for the time it takes to think. He held to that country as to a child's hand in a crowd. The world could have its theater. He would keep the road home from it passable. On a ridge above a plain that had been trampled into a diary, he watched a sunset that forgot for a moment the quarrels beneath it. The red softened into a kind of forgiveness the sky practices on itself. He thought of Nur al-Din, of a boy in Tikrit, of a mule in a narrow street, and the stick he had once taken from an angry hand. He thought of Jerusalem's keys wrapped in cloth in a grandmother's kitchen. He thought of Richard's blade, honest and impatient, and of the long arithmetic of rivers. He did not think of his name on lips yet unborn. He thought of supper in a barracks where men eat enough to be brave tomorrow and not enough to be cruel tonight. Night lifted. Drums practiced a mercy of silence. The hawks settled somewhere sensible. Between the day's banners and the day's graves, the camp slept under the law he had written into its breathing: rise early, pray steadily, pay on time, strike precisely, forgive deliberately, bury carefully, and do not squander the future to prove you own the present. Some wars end because a wall falls. Others end because a season remembers it has other work. This siege, long, patient, cruel in its repetition, refused both endings. It became a weather men were forced to live inside, tides of hope and retreat, mornings that began with ladders and ended with ledgers, nights that spoke in the clipped grammar of patrol calls and the quiet vowels of prayer. Acre wore the months like chain mail, each link a day hammered to fit the last. From the sea, crusader masts multiplied like stubborn reeds, their ropes humming arguments with the wind. From the land, earthworks crept forward in ribbed scars, the labor of men convinced that if they approached slowly enough, inevitability would forget to resist. Between the two pressures, the city inhaled sand and exhaled resolve. Salah al-Din refused to be educated by impatience. He treated the siege as a school whose only subject was endurance. Relief columns moved not as spectacle but as calendar, a caravan of grain wrapped in horses and dusk, a wedge of cavalry whose task was not to triumph but to force the enemy to spend his boldness before noon, a line of archers whose arrows arrived like punctuation at the precise moment a ladder pretended to be destiny. When they reached the city, they delivered competence as much as supplies, engineers who could persuade a wall to believe in itself again, physicians who could argue with fevers longer than despair could, scribes who counted losses without turning numbers into theater. He learned the enemy's habits the way a father learns a child's mischiefs, without malice, with exactness. Richard's strength announced itself with a kind of honorable impatience. He struck where effort could be seen, where courage might be tallied, where the day could be told as a story men would still want to hear when the aches had outlived the glory. Against such strength, the Sultan employed the opposite virtue, refusal to be cornered by narrative. He denied climaxes. He offered attrition flavored with mercy and logistics flavored with prayer. It is not simple to keep mercy fed in a season of repeated griefs. After Acre's captives were slaughtered, rage rose in the camp like a wind that wanted to own the tents. Men asked the permission of pain to govern. Salah al-Din answered with work. He ordered graves dug with dignity, scrolls written with the names of the nameless, stipends assigned to shadows that would never again become men in line. He set carpenters to fashion cradles for the newborn in the villages that fed the army, and he paid extra for each cradle finished before the next moon. "Why cradles?" a captain asked, half reproach, half plea. "Because that is how we refuse to become them," he said, and the sentence cooled the air like rain that knows where to fall. In councils, he permitted grief to speak first so that counsel could speak last. The captains argued for a bold strike to break the circle, an assault that would spend men like coins flung at a locked door. He listened, then traced with a finger the map's patient distances, the width of a marsh where horses would drown in their own courage, the reach of the ship's crossbowmen whose bolts wrote hard grammar across soft flesh, the slope of a hill that would befriend the enemy the moment the sun remembered noon. "We will not buy a moment with a year," he said. "We will buy a year with many sensible days." He rotated men the way a careful farmer rotates fields. Units that had learned too much of fear were assigned to roads, to the protection of caravans, to the rehearsals of competence that rebuild a soldier's self without forcing him to pretend before death. Units too in love with risk were tasked with ledger work in forward depots, where they discovered the courage it takes to count accurately while others make noise. Pride, properly employed, becomes reliability. In the city, captains sent notes tied to stones that landed like birds in the besiegers' trenches. Some were pleas, some were barters, some were prayers written in trade tongues. Salah al-Din answered the ones that deserved answers and ignored the ones that sought only to rehearse despair. He smuggled the musicians, one night only, so that a garrison could remember a scale that did not end in alarm. He sent in cloth and dye that would allow banners to be mended rather than replaced, because a mended banner teaches a kind of humility that helps men survive mornings. A sickness pressed along the lines, impartial as weather. He refused to demonize it or to romanticize those it chose. He established clinics in shade and assigned the healthiest mules to hauling water for them. He asked imams to preach sanitation as devotion, hands washed as ablution, latrines kept at a ritual distance as obedience. When healers quarreled over method, he instructed a judge to arbitrate and write a short code for camp hygiene, enforceable and dull. Dullness saves more lives than courage admits. Sometimes, when the moon was thin and the sea agreed to be friendlier than usual, Richard would send for parley. The two men met with the formality owed to history and the unembellished sentences owed to soldiers who would pay for the adjectives. They talked of exchanges, grain for prisoners, hours for the wounded, corridors of truce along which dead could be carried without inspiring new death. They disagreed like craftsmen, each sure of his material, each unwilling to pretend a flaw was a feature. Salah al-Din left those meetings neither comforted nor inflamed. He left reminded that history, too, has restraints, and that greatness is often merely the refusal to lie to your adversary about your own intentions. The siege taught the Sultan a new economy, the currency of attention. He learned to spend it where it multiplied rather than where it was merely seen. A village mill repaired prevented a dozen thefts. A fair court ruling posted publicly prevented 100 resentments. A monk's path to a monastery kept open by 2 extra watchmen prevented a story of desecration that would have cost blood to erase. He invested relentlessly in such invisible profits. The impatient called it caution. He called it sovereignty. There were days of far thunder, skirmishes at Tyre, a raid turned aside near Jaffa, each a fragment of a sentence history would later pretend to read in a single breath. He resisted the seduction of treating each as finale. Instead, he wrote through lines across them: supply, restraint, timing, the protection of non-combatants, the training of young officers in the art of staying unseen until the moment of usefulness. He promoted men who lacked theatrical courage, but possessed the rarer kind that allows a commander to end a day with more options than he began it with. Within his tent, he kept 2 tables, one for maps and one for letters. On the map table, sand scattered in thin drift from boots traced the truth all generals know, that ground, more than intention, determines what a man can do. On the letter table, replies multiplied to governors who wanted permission to shame enemies publicly, to qadis who wanted sharper punishments to please frightened nobles, to poets who wanted authorization to make the war simpler than it was. He answered no, gently and repeatedly, reserving yes for wells, bridges, schools, and grain. A rumor reached him that his patience had been misread as fatigue by certain allies who preferred spectacle to statecraft. He responded not with a speech but with a morning inspection at the forward redoubts, a surprise audit of rations that ended with back pay distributed at the line, a brief, unsmiling visit to a hospital where he lifted a boy's head for a sip and corrected a bandage with the same fingers that signed treaties. The rumor died, bored of itself. So the siege went on, a season pretending to be a sentence. The city held. The ring tightened, loosened, tightened again. The sea pretended indifference, and then volunteered storms at useful hours. The men on both sides learned to name stars that had never once cared which prayer rose beneath them. And still, each dawn, the order went out the same and was obeyed: breathe, count, mend, guard, write, forgive, strike only where the map agrees that striking saves a future. At last, the day came when Acre could no longer translate courage into endurance. Terms were bargained, bent, nearly agreed, betrayed, avenged, the whole dismal ballet of men learning too late how dear clean endings are. The city changed hands. The war changed its costume. The siege that would not end, ended, and yet nothing ended, because sieges are only chapters that pretend to be books. Salah al-Din rode the ridge above the harbor, and watched the enemy banners discover their own weight in the onshore wind. He did not curse them. He counted ships, then promises, then the miles of road he still owned between coast and holy city. He instructed his quartermasters to prepare for a campaign of tides rather than walls. Jaffa, Ascalon, the shuttling dance by which an army learns to be both shield and messenger. He ordered poets to write of patience and carpenters to build wagons and judges to travel with the columns. He sent a hawk into the evening and watched it take the air as if air were a vow that would hold. He slept that night as men sleep who have won and lost on the same day, lightly, with gratitude for breath and a list of names for mourning. The siege had taught him what crowns often forget, that greatness is not the art of ending stories but of leaving them inhabitable after you pass through. Tomorrow will ask for that art again. He would answer with the only grammar he trusted, restraint first, then resolve, mercy first, then measure, prayer at the hinge of each decision, and movement only when the ground itself seemed to nod. Winter does not ask for permission. It writes its name on a man's bones and then looks to see if the heart will learn to pronounce it. Along the coast, rain arrived with knives hidden in its sleeves. Roads dissolved into stubborn rivers. Tents learned humility. The best swords in two worlds rusted like ordinary metal when a soldier forgot to clean them before sleep. The war, which had roared itself hoarse, settled into the grammar of letters. Ink became a second cavalry. Couriers rode with messages sewn near the skin, words warm from the animal heat of the human they might outlive. From his table, lamp steady, maps weighted by smooth stones, Salah al-Din wrote sentences disciplined enough to carry a season. To governors, measure justice by winter rules. To generals, move on time, move light, and leave the ground no angrier than when you arrived. To judges, do not let fear make the law loud. To imams, praise patience in a language that makes the hungry feel seen. To quartermasters, count twice. Mercy needs arithmetic. Across the rain, letters moved in the other direction, Richard's hand, stiff with weather and candor, proposing shapes for peace that would let the sea keep its pride and the shrines keep their breath. Their exchanges were not poetry, they were carpentry. Each question was a board, each answer a brace. Would pilgrims walk without escort? Would coastal towns trade like mouths learning to share air? Would a truce be a corridor or a country? Between their two stubbornnesses, a structure tested itself against wind. When the rain drew back its knives and revealed the usual mud beneath, armies remembered how to be armies. Richard struck fast where speed was timekeeping, and Salah al-Din refused to be late where lateness would become a story. Between skirmish and parley, the Sultan spent more hours with ledgers than with lances. His enemies called it timidity. His soldiers learned it was the way bread wins arguments no sword can finish. The long shadow of winter was not only weather. It was also fatigue that walked through the camp with small feet and convincing reasons. A captain, brilliant in noon, became clumsy at dusk. A young officer discovered that courage, unwatered by sleep, turns brittle and snaps in the hand. There were days when men asked to be angry because anger is easier to organize than despair. Salah al-Din answered with work he could have assigned to subordinates, but chose to shoulder in public. Audits at the front lines, rations weighed in his presence, promotion lists argued with a stubborn fairness that made both the favored and the passed over feel witnessed. Leadership is the art of preventing private storms from becoming weather. He gave winter a use. Engineers, those unthanked priests, were set to teaching wells how to remember summer. Carpenters learned to build wagons that would not sulk at the first rut. Physicians trained boys whose hands shook to steady other hands. Clerks copied treaties in neat, unhurried scripts so that, when the mouths that had agreed them were tired, the paper would still be calm. He sent scholars to the front with thin books on the law of truce, what may be traded, who must be guarded, how to speak to an enemy without flattering your own cowardice. Armies that study law in rain fight more cleanly in sun. Envoys came into his tent with faces that practiced neutrality, and eyes that couldn't help rehearsing the future. The bargaining was exact. Prisoners for prisoners, but not as theater, corridors for pilgrims, but not as parades, ceilings for taxes, because greed is a siege no wall survives. He refused triumphs that could not survive a mother's questions. He accepted concessions that taught the next generation to suspect certainty. Each signature was a brittle winter branch that might bear spring if handled without vanity. Once, a monk asked for passage to a monastery that slept against a ridge where the wind mispronounced men's names. The guard at the checkpoint had been dutiful to the edge of cruelty, which is where some duties like to settle. The monk's sandals told the story of an honest poverty. Salah al-Din corrected the order, not the guard. A rule must always leave room for God to pass, he said, and the monk went on, and the guards stood a fraction taller because their obedience had been remembered, not humiliated. In this way, small permissions grew a city out of winter. There were letters he wrote and did not send. One, to a boy he had seen limping from a practice yard, anger hidden beneath a careful salute, "You will not always be chosen. Learn to be ready when you are." Another, to the ghost of a mentor who had taught him how to keep the law's spine straight in a season that wanted to make it a whip, "We have opened gates with clauses. We have held swords by their hilts, and our tongues by their roots. Come winter's end, may the city still know which hand to trust." He folded these unsent pages and placed them beneath the map stones, anchoring the future with unspoken vows. Pilgrims began to move again, tentative as deer, then braver when the first travelers returned with nothing more dramatic to report than bread purchased and wells found clean. The truces, stitched with caution, held where competence stood watch and frayed where pride was left alone with itself. He reinforced them not with more parchment, but with habits, fair weights in markets, taxes posted publicly at mosque doors, a garrison officer demoted quietly for treating a merchant like furniture. The rumor that a man could walk to a shrine without being recruited by somebody's fury did more to cool the coast than 100 patrols. Richard and Salah al-Din met once more under a sky that could not decide whether it was finished with rain. Their talks circled the same hill of questions, not from weakness, but because circles are how you measure a hill before you cut a road through it. They did not feign friendship. They practiced respect, the humbler currency. When they rose, nothing had been solved that men cannot unsolve, and yet the air seemed arranged for a season in which children could learn the sound of their own streets again. The Sultan's health began to measure time more loudly. Fevers visited like unwelcome relatives, polite at first, then proprietorial, then demanding. He worked between their hours, moving appointments earlier, eating later, shortening sleep without letting the camp feel the cost. In his tent, A physician scolded him with the intimacy men earn by saving other men's mornings. "If you break," the physician said, "the city will limp in places that cannot be bandaged." He obeyed a little. Obedience, in a ruler, is a rare and useful medicine. One evening, he walked the ramparts of a town that had once practiced panic as a virtue and now rehearsed calm. The sea argued with itself below. Stars practiced their uninterest in banners. He listened for the music of a city at peace, the almost laughter of markets closing, the small brass of a pot being set down gently, the discreet thunder of a gate shutting for the night, because shutting is what gates should do, not to announce fear, but to finish a sentence called day. He thought of all the letters he had written, all the treaties held together by the unglamorous glue of decency, and he knew that winter had done its deeper work. It had trained the muscles that spring would need. At last, the treaty that could be borne by the tired and the honest arrived, the kind that neither side celebrates with fireworks because it will be saved or squandered in kitchens, not in courtyards. Pilgrimage would move along roads guarded more by custom than by spear. The coast would speak in the grammar of trade again. The shrines would breathe under supervision light enough to be mistaken for mere weather. He signed with a hand that had learned to steady itself across years of restraint. News traveled. Not with the speed of conquest, but with the steady gait of mules carrying something that will still matter next week. Mothers unpacked keys from cloth, not to leave, but to remember that leaving was no longer the only answer. Boys dared to complain about chores again, which is how a city learns it is alive. A judge hung a new schedule outside his court that began at dawn, not out of piety, but because morning is when men tell the truth most cleanly. A monk, the same one, returned from his ridge and nodded at the guard as if to say, "We have both done our part." In the ledger no one else saw, Salah al-Din added a line, "We owed the dead a season in which the living learned gentleness." He closed the book and breathed the thin, satisfied breath a man takes when the day has finished exactly as much as it could and no more. The hawk passed once, a dark comma in a sentence the sky was finishing without him. Below, lamps multiplied like quiet verdicts. He felt the edge of an exhaustion that was not despair, only the body counting its spent coins. The long shadow of winter had lengthened his patience into a shelter others could borrow. Spring, when it came, would have to be tended like a treaty, weeded of vanity, watered with dull kindness, guarded from men who write their names too large. He slept with papers on his table and a map under his hand, as if the land itself were a pulse he could comfort. In his sleep, children crossed thresholds without rehearsing fear. Doors held. Swords remembered their scabbards. The city did not say his name. That was the point. There comes a season when even the strongest roofs listen for rain with a different attention, as if the house itself has learned it is mortal. In Damascus, the air had the taste of pomegranate and dust, and the city walked more softly as winter thinned into a careful spring. Letters still traveled. Courts still sat. Markets still taught the old arithmetic of fairness. But the camp's breath had changed, as a stallion's breath changes when the road behind becomes longer than the road ahead. Salah al-Din woke to a body that had begun to count time for him. Fevers arrived without preface, like messengers who knew they were already known. He received them as he had received envoys and enemies, seated courteous, exact. A physician listened at the threshold of his chest and frowned at the rhythm of a drum that had learned a new cadence. Rest, the man said, in that way healers have, as if rest were an order a king could command upon himself. I will, the Sultan answered, meaning later, meaning after the work that refuses to be ashamed of its own necessity. He reduced his table again, conspicuously. He lightened the silk of ceremonies until it was only thread. He increased the weight of schedules, the true crown he had always worn. A petitioner's hour still stood like a doorway at dawn. Rations were still weighed with unflattering honesty. Judges still found their names posted beside their rulings so that law could be married to memory. He moved slower between these stations, yes, but the city learned to slow with him. People adjust their stride to a man they trust. At evening, he took to walking atop the wall with fewer companions and longer silences. The orchards beyond the gates rehearsed their green. The muezzin's voice braided with the small iron music of shop shutters being set, lifted, set again. He stopped once where the wind remembered Aleppo and placed his hand against stone that had listened to older rulers promise the same impossible thing, that their names would guard the city forever. He did not make that promise. He asked the wall to remember the law instead. Stone is better at remembering habits than faces. Visitors came, governors secure enough to admit worry, soldiers who had earned the right to speak without trimming their sentences, scholars who scolded him about sleep, widows who thanked him with the exact coin of a steady gaze. He sent each away with tasks that did not depend on him. Who will judge when I am absent? To a Qadi who had buried a son and learned the difference between strictness and cruelty. Who will count at dawn? To a clerk who had once been bored by arithmetic, and had become loyal to its mercy. Who will keep the gates unafraid of their hinges? To a captain whose courage had learned to arrive on time rather than in costume. He gave away what remained of the wealth men think they need to be obeyed, coins to debtors whose shame outweighed their balances, garments to men whose dignity had frayed at the cuffs, horses to officers whose usefulness had outlived their pride. He kept one thing, and it was not his name. It was the ledger where victories were measured by mothers unorphaned and streets unbloodied. He set it open on the table as if the day itself were welcome to correct it. On a long afternoon that never quite decided to be evening, a boy came to the courtyard too young for etiquette and too brave for shyness. He carried a wooden sword with the seriousness of a clerk bearing a sum. When I grow, he announced, I will wear iron and make enemies afraid. The Sultan, seated beneath a shade that remembered many counsels, smiled the way physicians smile when a diagnosis is the ordinary fever of youth. Wear patience first, he said. Iron rusts faster than restraint. The boy looked unconvinced, as boys must when the future is still a mirror that flatters. But what if they do not fear me? He insisted. Then they may live near you, Salah al-Din answered. And that is the better victory. The child left to practice a slower cut. In this way, a city bequeaths its habits not by proclamations but by sentences a boy cannot forget when he learns to shave. News still arrived, shaped like obligation, a governor who needed reminding that bribery is merely theft in a better robe, a garrison that had begun to believe boredom entitles men to cruelty, a merchant guild that mistook scarcity for license. Each he answered with the same trio: letter, envoy, example, and men watching learned the same thing 100 times, which is how learning becomes custom, that leadership is not heat, but light, not appetite, but timing, not the theater of righteousness, but its practice at small tables where food is divided until nothing is left starving but greed. At night, the fevers pressed harder. He prayed softly, not for length of days, but for the right length of duties, enough to place weights on the scales where they would be remembered after his hand released them. He dreamed of doorways and of gates that opened at the correct hour with the correct sound, not a scream, not a boast, merely the obedience of hinges to mornings they trust. He called his sons and his counselors and said what men almost never say soon enough: keep the law steadier than the banners, keep the poor nearer than the poets, keep your appetites on a leash long enough for the widow to sleep. He did not try to turn his life into a single lesson. He scattered it like seed, trusting that much would be lost to birds and weather, and that enough would find soil. Spend generosity early, he added, so that you cannot later afford cruelty. A prince frowned as princes do when advice spends their imagined treasures. If I am generous early, the young man said carefully, what will I give later? Yourself, answered the father, and the room understood the cost. He asked that debtors be found before theologians, that warehouses be measured before poets rehearsed victory, that prisoners be counted before enemies were described in flattering shapes. Leave no man nameless, he said, a sentence simple enough to be obeyed even by those who disliked it. The clerk who wrote it down did so without ornament. The wisdom was its own ink. The last fever arrived without rhetoric. Breaths narrowed to their useful core. The room was arranged with the decencies he had required of other rooms. Clean water, a window left unboastfully open, a mat rolled so that humility had space to sit. The city outside went on with the business he had hoped to leave it, markets bargaining themselves into fairness, teachers instructing boys to respect words before they learn to weaponize them, a judge lifting his pen and lowering a quarrel. He asked for no parade, no final oration. He asked for a ledger and a prayer. The physician wept with the average man's courage. It is a sturdier kind than most kings practice. Drink, the healer urged. I have drunk, said the patient, and meant more than water. An aide offered him a robe finer than he had used for. He refused it with the tilt of the head that had once silenced courts. Give it to a groom, he whispered. He works nearer to breath than I. He kept one blanket, thin and clean and borrowed from no one's hunger. In the last quiet, he turned his face, as men turn toward any consistent wind, to the city he had kept. He did not count fortresses or fealties. He counted doors not broken to prove a point, and laws that had been obeyed without fear, and children who had learned that a uniform can pass without taking anything. He let his hand rest on the table where maps had bowed beneath stones and treaties had dried into weather. His fingers stilled on a corner of parchment, as if testing the pulse of the land one more time. The breath left as a good guest leaves, without rearranging the furniture, without making a speech to the furniture it will not see again. The room remained tidy, the window still as a promise that had learned not to brag, the water a clear sentence waiting for another mouth. Outside, the first call braided roofs together. Men rose. Women lifted mournings onto their shoulders. A child complained about bread. The city did not tremble because a single tent had learned silence. It continued, which is the only monument mercy desires. News traveled with the speed of grief. Damascus lowered its own voice. Cairo reread the laws posted at its mosque doors. Aleppo corrected a price in the market for the sake of a sultan who had once paid exact coin and stood in a line. In Jerusalem, a guard opened a gate on time and remembered a sentence he had been given to carry. Do not make the hinge afraid. Across the coast, men who had fought him honestly bowed toward a horizon that had learned his measure, and envoys wrote letters that admitted, in careful Latin and fuller Arabic, that a man had shown the world how to be strong without making weakness a profession. He left behind very little that could be counted by men who inventory wealth. He left schedules that would outlast cleverness. He left customs that made cruelty expensive. He left, most of all, a country made not of contiguities but of agreements, between market and minaret, between judge and soldier, between mother and mourning. And something else he left, which cannot be weighed, an evergreen of mercy that kept a season for discipline and a season for release and taught them to respect each other's hours. Years would practice forgetting. Names swell, recede, distort, become carved and then eroded. Legends arrive late and refuse to leave, tutoring truth in the art of yielding gracefully. But a city is less vulnerable to legends than to neglect. Where his hand had passed, wells remained honest longer. Doors remembered their hinges. Children were bored by peace. A poor man could be corrected without being humiliated. These, not the horns of a hill or the keys of a shrine, were his empire. In the customs house at a quiet gate on an ordinary morning, a clerk lifted his eyes to a traveler who had miscounted his goods. He corrected the sum with courtesy, then wrote it cleanly. He did not demand a bribe. He did not enjoy his small power. He looked up once more, toward the window where birds practiced their lawless treaties in air, and he nodded to no one in particular, as men do when the city itself feels well run. There is a kind of victory that wears no laurel because it refuses to end. It is not painted, it is practiced. It is not sung, it is scheduled. It is mercy with a spine and justice with hands. It rises at dawn and counts, and prays, and pays, and forgives, and corrects, and lies down without complaint. It does not remember names, it remembers habits. And if one listens at certain doors in certain cities on certain mornings, one can still hear its quiet anthem, doors that open, swords that rest, children who do not rehearse fear, and the steady breath of a people who have learned to be strong enough to be gentle.